Declaro abierto.
The 8,234th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Women and Peace and Security, preventing sexual violence and conflict through empowerment, gender equality, and access to justice. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Argentina, Austria, Bahrain, Bangladesh, Belgium, Botswana, Brazil, Canada, Colombia, Costa Rica, Croatia, the Czech Republic, Egypt, Estonia, Germany, Indonesia, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Iraq, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Japan, Jordan, Liechtenstein, Lithuania, Mexico, Montenegro, Myanmar, Namibia, Nigeria, Norway, Pakistan, Paraguay, Portugal, Qatar, Slovakia, Slovenia, South Africa, Spain, the Sudan, Switzerland, the Syrian Arab Republic, Turkey, Ukraine, the United Arab Emirates, and Uruguay to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting: Mrs. Pramila Patten, Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence and Conflict, and Mrs. Razia Sultana, Senior Researcher of Caledon Press. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite the following to participate in this meeting: Mr. Gerten van den Akker, Chargé d'Affaires of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations; Mrs. Fatima Kiari Mohammed, Permanent Observer of the African Union to the United Nations; and Mrs. Claire Hutchinson, NATO Secretary General, Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security. I propose that the Council invite the Permanent Observer of the Observer State of the Holy See to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objections, it is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document /2018/250, the report of the Secretary General on conflict-related sexual violence. I wish to also draw the attention of Council members to document S/2018/311, a letter dated 2 April 2018 from the Permanent Representative of Peru to the United Nations addressed to the Secretary General, transmitting a concept paper on the item under discussion. I wish to warmly welcome the Deputy Secretary General, Her Excellency Mrs. Amina Mohammed, and give her the floor.
Thank you very much. Mr. President of the Security Council, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me begin by commending Peru and His Excellency Ambassador Gustavo Meza Correa for convening this important meeting debate on sexual violence and conflict. I also very warmly welcome Ms. Razia Sultana here today to amplify the voices of the Rohingya community and to offer an account of the plight of women and girls systematically targeted due to their religion and ethnicity. This year in Myanmar and in many other conflict situations, the widespread threat and use of sexual violence has once again been used as a tactic to advance military, economic, and ideological objectives. And once again, it has been a driver of massive forced displacement. Let me be clear, both genders endure the horrific brutality of sexual violence in conflict. Sexual violence is also a very common method of torture of detainees, and in many conflicts, most detainees are men and boys, but overall, women and girls are disproportionately affected. Gender-based discrimination is the invisible driver of most crimes of sexual violence, and the lower a woman's status in terms of wealth, health, and education, the greater is her vulnerability and exposure to harm. Last year, I traveled with SRSG Pramila Patten to Nigeria and to the Democratic Republic of Congo. In both nations, the consequences of sexual violence are profound and enduring for survivors, their families, and their communities. Survivors are forced to live with the untreated physical and psychological trauma, the social stigma, and unwanted pregnancies. The children born of rape are often ostracized and relegated to the margins of society. This highlights yet again that in the end, sexual violence has consequences for all affected, women, girls, men, and boys. It is a deliberate tactic to humiliate and disempower and undermine social cohesion. Our responsibility must be to bring justice, recognition, and reparations to the survivors of these horrendous crimes. Not only justice in the courtrooms, but also social justice and economic empowerment. We should recognize and support the resilience of the many survivors who are working as agents of change. And if we are to prevent these crimes being repeated, we must ensure accountability and deterrence. In that context, I welcome the continued engagement by those parties listed by the Secretary-General in his reports on conflict-related sexual violence. For example, the signing of a unilateral communiqué by a coalition of armed groups in Mali in July 2017, and the development of a joint communiqué implementation plan by the Iraq government last month are all very encouraging. Excellencies, let me also highlight the increased vigilance being shown by our peacekeepers in protecting women, girls, men, and boys from sexual violence as part of their protection of civilian mandate. Last month, in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo, a female engagement team of 16 soldiers from the United Kingdom, South Africa, and Nepal supported a civilian mission to one of the country's most remote areas in response to reports of abductions and sexual violence inflicted on hundreds of civilians. This shows the value of alert networks and the importance of women in peacekeeping to better address conflict-related sexual violence. Women's protection advisors deployed to UN peace operations also have a leading role to play in supporting government counterparts to implement their commitments. These commitments include engaging all parties to the conflict to prevent sexual violence, and they include ensuring that survivors and civil society organizations can voice their concerns about security, protection, and limitations in service provision, and that they can help shape inclusive new policies and laws. Excellencies, Security Council Resolution 2106 calls on all actors, the Security Council, parties to armed conflict, member states, and United Nations entities, to do much more to combat impunity for these crimes. Let us intensify our efforts to end the horrific litany of sexual violence in conflict, so that our women, girls, men, and boys have no less burden to bear as they work to rebuild their shattered lives. I thank you.
Doy las gracias a la...
I thank Her Excellency Mrs. Mohammed for her briefing, a very interesting briefing. I now give the floor to Mrs. Pramila Patten.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, I'm delighted to join you today for the first open debate on sexual violence in conflict of my tenure as SRSG. Allow me to start by expressing my appreciation to Peru for chairing this meeting and for their leadership on the Women, Peace and Security agenda. The focus of this debate on preventing sexual violence in conflict through empowerment, gender equality, and access to justice could not be more timely or more in line with my own vision for advancing this mandate. When I took up office last June, I outlined a three-pillar priority agenda, namely converting cultures of impunity into cultures of deterrence through consistent and effective prosecution, addressing structural gender-based inequality as the root cause and invisible driver of sexual violence in times of war and peace, and fostering national ownership and leadership for a sustainable, survivor-centered response that empowers civil society and local women's rights defenders. Another important first is the participation in today's debate of Mrs. Razia Sultana on behalf of the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security. Ms. Sultana is the first Rohingya woman born in northern Rakhine State, Myanmar, to brief this council on the plight of her people. Her presence here is a historic opportunity to give a face and a voice to a community that has been denied a nationality, denied an identity, and even denied a name. Her perspective will be particularly valuable on the eve of the Council's first visit to Myanmar and Bangladesh. Indeed, voices from directly affected communities provide the ground truths that must guide our action, and I trust that her message will be heard and heeded. The annual open debate on sexual violence in conflict provides a critical opportunity for taking stock of how we are progressing or regressing in this agenda. The data and trend analysis presented in the annual report of the Secretary General serves not only to measure progress, but also to inspire and accelerate it. It was exactly 1 decade ago, in 2008, that this Council adopted the groundbreaking Resolution 1820, which elevated the issue of conflict-related sexual violence onto its agenda as a threat to security and impediment to peace. It urged us to debunk the myths that fuel sexual violence, and indeed the notion of rape as an inevitable byproduct of war or mere collateral damage can never again serve as an alibi for inaction. Since then, the issue has been systematically included in the mandates of peacekeeping missions, reflected in the designation criteria of sanctions regimes, addressed in ceasefire agreements, and excluded from amnesty provisions. Women's protection advisors have been deployed to field missions to generate actionable information and pursue a protection dialogue with parties to conflict. Today, we are supporting thousands of survivors we were not reaching a decade ago. Resolution 1820 demanded nothing less than the immediate and complete cessation by all parties to armed conflict of all acts of sexual violence against civilians. In that respect, while significant normative and operational progress has been achieved, it is clear that words on paper are not yet matched by facts on the ground. We have not yet moved from resolutions to lasting solutions. I believe we are at an inflection point in this agenda and must urgently consolidate progress by ensuring accountability or risk a reversal, resulting in wartime rape being once again normalized due to the frequency and impunity with which it is committed. The past decade of enhanced political momentum to combat sexual violence has coincided with a confluence of global crises, including mass migration and displacement, rising violent extremism and terrorism, the resurgence and spread of conflict, and the proliferation of arms. These factors have created the conditions for renewed patterns of violations. Indeed, the report before us shows that in 2017, sexual violence continued to be employed as a tactic of war, a tactic of terrorism, and a tool of political repression. Across a range of settings, it was used by parties to conflict, to attack, and alter the ethnic or religious identity of persecuted groups, and to change the very demographics of disputed regions. The threat of sexual violence continued to serve as a driver of forced displacement and has inhibited the return of uprooted communities to their areas of origin, especially in the absence of accountability for past crimes. In this way, conflict-related sexual violence has led to the dispossession of land, resources, and identity. Trafficking of women and girls for the purpose of sexual exploitation continued to be an integral part of the political economy of war and terrorism, generating revenue for combatants and armed groups. Women and girls have also been gifted to combatants as part of a perverse system of rewarding and socializing recruits. A rising trend noted in the report is the recourse to negative and harmful coping mechanisms in response to the risk of rape in environments of instability and indigence. Early marriage has spiked in contexts where families have no other means of providing for or safeguarding their daughters. This has resulted in more repression in the name of protection. Indeed, sexual violence both arises from and reinforces unequal gender relations, impeding the realization of women's rights and freedoms. In several contexts, victims were forced to marry their rapists in the name of restoring social harmony and family honor. Survivors endured multiple intersecting stigmas in the wake of sexual violence, including the stigma of association with an armed or terrorist group, and of bearing children conceived through rape by the enemy. Often, these women and children are viewed as affiliates rather than victims of violent extremist groups, and vilified as threats to the communities they seek to rejoin. The divisive force of stigma prevents family reconciliation, in some cases leading to renewed displacement, with survivors fleeing to escape reprisals by their own relatives or communities. Stigma can have lethal repercussions, including honor killings, suicide, untreated diseases such as HIV, traumatic fistula, unsafe abortion, maternal mortality, extreme poverty, and high-risk survival behavior. Stigma and victim blame give the weapon of rape its uniquely destructive power, including the power to shred the social fabric and turn victims into outcasts. It is also the reason that sexual violence remains one of the least reported of all crimes. The plight of children conceived as a result of wartime rape demands urgent attention. These children may be left stateless, in a legal limbo, and vulnerable to recruitment, radicalization, trafficking, and exploitation, with wider implications for peace and security. Colombia is the only country in which children conceived through rape are legally recognized as victims, though the fear of stigma has prevented many from coming forward to seek redress. Male survivors of sexual violence have had their social status, identity, and sexual orientation called into question. In some countries, this can even result in their arrest. Despite some landmark cases, such as the ICC ruling in the trial of Bosco Taganda in 2017, mass rape continues to be met with mass impunity. This means that the vicious cycle of violence, impunity, and revenge continues unabated in many nations torn by war. For instance, it is a travesty and an outrage that not a single member of ISIL or Boko Haram has yet been convicted for sexual violence as an international crime. Although the report before us paints a bleak, at times harrowing picture of brutality, it is also important to highlight the progress achieved at country level. For instance, the armed forces of Côte d'Ivoire were delisted last year following the adoption of concrete action plans and concerted efforts to prevent and punish sexual violence. No new cases or allegations concerning members of the Ivorian armed and security forces were recorded in 2017, which shows what is possible when political will and risk mitigation measures are in place. Several other states continue to implement joint communique and action plans to curb conflict-related sexual violence, such as Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, Guinea, Iraq, Somalia, and South Sudan. I look forward to other parties that appear in the list, such as the Myanmar Armed Forces and the Sudanese Armed Forces, adopting similar communique or frameworks of cooperation with my office. Another instructive example is that of Colombia, which elevated gender justice to the heart of its peace process, resulting in thousands of survivors receiving reparations for sexual violence. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, a former parliamentarian in Kavumu, South Kivu province, was convicted in 2017 for the rapes of 39 young children committed by his militia as a crime against humanity. This trial brought an end to the serial rapes in Kavumu and helped to disband a militia that was threatening local security. In addition, hundreds of prosecutions have been undertaken by the Congolese authorities with support from MONUSCO and the team of experts on the rule of law, which is part of my office. A number of significant law reform initiatives also took place in 2017 to delink rape from adultery and morality crimes, such as seen in Afghanistan, Somalia, and Sudan. Mr. President, the history of wartime rape has been a history of denial. On my visits to countries of concern, I still encounter attempts to deny or downplay this issue. Yet, such an approach serves no one, not the government, not the credibility and efficacy of national institutions, and not the people trying to come to terms with the past and build a better future. No problem can be solved through silence. We will never be able to prevent what we are unable or unwilling to understand. At this critical juncture, we cannot lose focus. We must keep the searchlight of international scrutiny on this historically hidden crime. When I think of what is at stake, I think of the thousands of women and children who remain in the captivity of groups like ISIL and Boko Haram. I think of the women released, pregnant or with children, from the grip of a terrorist group who are forced to choose between their babies and their communities of origin that refuse to accept them. I think of the faces of the survivors I have met in the DRC, Iraq, Darfur, Nigeria, Guinea, and in the teeming camps in Bangladesh. I think of the Bosnian man who reduced the room to tears by describing his struggle for identity and belonging, having been born of wartime rape and orphaned by prejudice and stigma. If the Security Council resolutions on sexual violence tell us one thing, it is that wartime rape is preventable and not inevitable. Addressing it is our collective responsibility. The survivors are watching and waiting. We cannot afford to fail them. Mr. President, members of the Council, looking forward, I would like to propose 3 recommendations. Firstly, I call on the international community to give serious consideration to the establishment of a reparations fund for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence, to help them rebuild their lives and livelihoods. Reparative justice is what survivors want most, yet receive least. Secondly, we need a more operational response to stigma alleviation, because stigma kills. Socioeconomic reintegration support for sexual violence survivors and their children must infuse peace-building, reconstruction, and reconciliation efforts. In cases where survivors face ongoing risk, I encourage states to adopt special quota projects to help relocate women and children to third countries, following the precedent set by Germany to protect members of the Iraqi Yazidi community. Similar consideration should be given to the most vulnerable Rohingya women and children. And thirdly, we need to marshal sustained political resolve and resources equal to the scale of the challenge. The gender-based violence response in humanitarian settings remain chronically underfunded, and we see time and time again how a lack of resources translates into a lack of protection. The report before us should serve as an alarm and a wake-up call to the onset of any donor fatigue. Despite all the challenges, what gives me hope is the way that women from Liberia, Colombia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and elsewhere have used their experience as survivors of sexual violence to mobilize political movements for peace. They have become galvanized and organized in response to this threat and have begun to channel that impetus into political aspirations to ensure that the dark chapters of their nation's history never repeat. We must support these efforts to enhance women's participation and influence, because after all, empowerment is protection. Thank you, Mr. President.
Le agradezco a la señora Patten por
I would like to thank Madam Patton for that very informative presentation.
ahora la palabra.
I now give the floor to Madam Rasia Sultana.
Mr. President, Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I am a Rohingya lawyer, researcher, and educator specializing in trauma, mass rape, and trafficking of Rohingya girls and women. I have been working directly with Rohingya women and girls in the refugee camp in Bangladesh since 2014. As a senior researcher, I have worked with Kaladan Press on a few reports. I am a coordinator of the Free Rohingya Coalition, director of Rohingya National Organization Women's Section, and the founder of Rohingya Women Welfare. I speak today on behalf of my people who have been driven from our motherland. Where I come from, women and girls have been gang raped, tortured, and killed by the Myanmar army for no other reason than for being Rohingya. I also speak today on behalf of the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security. Since August last year, over 670,000 Rohingya have fled Myanmar. This is the fastest refugee movement since the Rwanda genocide. I am extremely grateful to Bangladesh for opening its border. However, the international community, especially the UN Security Council, has failed us. This latest crisis should have been prevented if the warning signs since 2012 had not been ignored. Since then, state security forces have committed human rights abuses against the Rohingya. Officials have since placed severe restriction on our freedom of movement, which limited access to livelihoods, healthcare, food, and education. Discrimination against Rohingya people dates as far back as 1982, what it actually starts from 1975, when we were stripped of our citizenship rights. Many of Myanmar's other ethnic minorities, including the Karen, Kachin, Shin, Hmong, and Shan, have also faced decades of intense discrimination, rape, and other human violations by the military operating with impunity. Other ethnic women's groups in Myanmar have been documenting this pattern for decades. In 2002, Shan Group released a report with the same pattern of gang rape, killing, and mutilation. In 2014, the Women's League of Burma released a report documenting rape over 100 ethnic women by the Myanmar army. This showed how even after election 2010, the Myanmar army was still raping ethnic women with impunity. What is happening now is only on a much larger scale. My own research and interviews provide evidence that government troops raped well over 300 women and girls in 17 villages in Rakhine State, with over 350 villages attacked and burned since August 2017. This number is likely only a fraction of the actual total number of women raped. Girls as young as 6 were gang raped. Women and girls were caught and gang raped in their homes as they were running away or trying to cross the Bangladesh border. Some were horribly mutilated and burned alive. Sexual violence involved hundreds of soldiers and occurred across a vast part of Rakhine State. Such scale and breadth provides strong evidence that rape was systematically planned and used as a weapon against my people. The pattern of mutilation of women's private parts after rape suggests a specific directive to instill terror among Rohingya people, but also to destroy their very means of reproduction. With hundreds of thousands of troops deployed across Myanmar, this has horrifying implications for the safety of women and girls across the country. There are similar situations around the world, such as in Syria and Yemen. In Yemen, more than 3 million women and girls are at risk of sexual and gender-based violence. In Syria, the Commission of Inquiry has found that sexual violence carried out by the government forces and militias formed part of widespread and systematic attacks directed against the civilian population. Rohingya continue to flee today, and humanitarian organizations estimate that 60% of displaced Rohingya currently in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh are women and girls. Had Bangladesh closed its borders, the situation would have been considerably worse. However, the international community and humanitarian agencies need to urgently scale up health and protection service to support Rohingya refugees. This must include access to life-saving healthcare service, mental and psychosocial care, and improved condition of sanitation, water, and hygiene, despite the acute need post-rape care, including access to safe abortion and emergency contraception. It is critically low in camps. Women and girls with disability and the elderly face greater risks and needs which are not being addressed. There must be a faster registration process for NGOs with specialized humanitarian sexual reproductive health experience and in women's empowerment and protection programming. Of greatest concern to me are the increased incidence of young women being trafficked, some as young as 12 years old, young women and girls are either being kidnapped or promised job or marriage offer and then disappear. Many see no future and desperate to escape to a better life. They are easily trapped by the false promises and then never seen again. There have also been cases of young teenage boys being taken. I am working on an awareness campaign for parents and community leaders to provide their girls with a protected environment. Young Rohingya women have a vital role to play in this awareness raising and in coordinating humanitarian assistance in the camps. They should be encouraged to volunteer as they will be trusted by their community to relay vital information and at the same time will learn important leadership skills. Many young Rohingya women in the refugee camp want to help their people and be actively involved in the future of their community. They need to be supported and provided the necessary training to do so. It is time to empower our Rohingya women and girls with vision, respect, and support whatever way we can. Later this month, the Security Council will be visiting the refugee camps in Cox's Bazar and then going to Myanmar. During this visit, you must meet with women and girl survivors. I could facilitate safe meeting. You must work with Bangladesh authorities to stop trafficking, pressure the Myanmar government and senior officials to cooperate with the UN fact-finding mission, and insist on unrestricted humanitarian access across Rakhine State. Rule of law must drive the response to the Rohingya crisis. International pressure is urgently needed to end impunity in Myanmar and support political and legal reform that end oppression of all ethnic peoples in Myanmar. Any return of refugees to Myanmar must be accordance with international standards and be safe, dignified, and voluntary. As the Advisory Commission on Rakhine State recommended and many members of the Council agreed, the government of Myanmar must address the central question of Rohingya citizenship, rights, freedom of movement, and equality before the law. About the citizenship, we people are not asking citizenship. We want back our citizenship right. My people must be guaranteed their safety upon return to Myanmar. My people must be guaranteed their safety upon return to Burma. The Myanmar military is listed for the first time in this year's Secretary General report on sexual violence in conflict. In light of this and the ongoing impunity of the army, the Security Council must refer the situation in Myanmar to the International Criminal Court without delay for its horrific crimes against Rohingya, as well as for violation against other ethnic groups in the country, including the Shan, Karen, Kachin, and other states. It is hypocritical to condemn the human rights violation and express horror at the new violence, while then also selling arms to Myanmar and seeks exploitative license to mine its natural resources. Member states committed to conflict prevention and sustaining peace cannot turn a blind eye to state-sanctioned ethnic minorities persecution, discrimination, or other human rights violations, including sexual violence for trade. This applies to Myanmar and all crises elsewhere. My statement today is not only for Rohingya women, but for my other ethnic sisters who are also facing atrocities. Women community leaders and leaders from different ethnicities across Myanmar are working together to build inter-ethnic peace and community relations. We believe in a peaceful and united Myanmar of all ethnicities. Thank you.
Las gracias.
I'd like to thank Madam Sultana for that very instructive and informative briefing. I now give the floor to the members of the Security Council. I'd like to begin by giving our most warm welcome to Her Excellency, Madam Alice Bah Kuhnke, Minister for Culture and Democracy of Sweden, and I give her the floor. You have the floor, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. President. I align myself with the statement to be delivered on behalf of the European Union, the Nordic countries, and the group of friends on women, peace, and security. Mr. President, let me begin by thanking Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed and a special representative of the Secretary General Pramila Patten for the thoughtful interventions this morning and for their leadership and concrete efforts to combat conflict-related sexual violence. I want to extend a particular word of welcome and thanks to Razia Sultana. Your testimony underlines the critical importance of using all tools available to this Council to prevent and respond to conflict-related sexual violence. In my position as the Swedish Minister for Culture and Democracy, with responsibilities such as national human rights, civil society, and the fight against discrimination and racism, I have met women and girls, men and boys seeking asylum in Sweden and listened to their testimonies. Stories about children in conflict areas, taken from their families, abducted, forced into sexual slavery, horrible atrocities. But it doesn't stop there. During their journey to Europe, they were once again abused and harassed, including in refugee camps. My role as a minister is to listen, to understand, and most importantly, to act. These testimonies, like Ms. Sultana's, cannot only be something we here are horrified by. Their stories must become the starting point for action. Regrettably, violence, oppression, and systematic subordination still mark the daily lives of countless women and girls. Conflict-related sexual violence brutalizes and traumatizes the victims and seeks to undermine and shatter communities and societies. Its impact cannot be overestimated. Addressing this scourge is a central part of the Security Council's work. Alarmingly, conflict-related sexual violence as a tactic of war and terrorism has reached new levels. This is a core security challenge. At the heart of this issue is the fundamental principle of women's full enjoyment of human rights, especially sexual and reproductive health and rights. The link between accountability and prevention is clear. Ensuring accountability and putting an end to impunity for violations and abuses against international law must be a priority for all of us, both inside and outside the Council. When Sweden joined the Security Council, we set out two overarching priorities: conflict prevention and women, peace, and security. Therefore, we thank Peru for organizing this open debate and welcome the focus in today's discussion. Mr. President, since 2014, Sweden has pursued a feminist foreign policy based on the 4 Rs: rights, representation, resources, and reality check. This means that throughout our foreign policy, including peace, security, trade, humanitarian and development efforts, we are applying a systematic gender perspective. Without the inclusion of and respect for all, a sustainable peace can never be achieved. We know that gender equality makes societies more peaceful. The ongoing Stockholm Forum on Gender Equality will cover many of these critical issues and seek common solutions. The Council needs to address the gender dynamics of the root causes of conflict. We must consider structural gender inequality as a critical element of the instability that hinders efforts to maintain or restore international peace and security. To achieve this, we need gendered conflict analysis, building a gender disaggregated data and solid gender expertise. We also need to build alliances with brave civil society actors who play an essential role in addressing conflict-related sexual violence and promoting gender equality. We fully support the Secretary General's recommendation that the Council considers the early warning signs of sexual violence in its monitoring of conflict situations. Last year, the Security Council added the first ever separate designation criteria on conflict-related sexual violence in the sanctions regime for the Central African Republic. However, having the criteria is not enough. Sanctions committees also need gender expertise. This year, when the Council renewed the sanctions regime for the Central African Republic, it added language to respond to this need. Let's work together to include similar criteria in all relevant sanctions regimes. Panels of experts must also be mandated to report to the sanctions committees on conflict-related sexual violence, and in cases where there are still no separate designation criteria, we encourage the panels to report under the international humanitarian law and/or human rights criteria. To further inform country-specific considerations, we encourage Council members and the broader membership to make full use of the documents and the meetings of the Security Council Experts Group on Women, Peace and Security. Mr. President, the importance of women in peacekeeping no longer needs to be justified. The evidence speaks for itself. With more female peacekeepers and police officers, we can achieve more and reach the whole population in a conflict area. Sweden is actively addressing factors that hinder the deployment of women peacekeepers, police, and corrections officers. Women, peace, and security is an integral part of pre-deployment training for all Swedish troops, and all deployed contingents have specially trained gender advisors. There are many good examples to be shared in this regard. We welcome the enhanced focus on access to justice and its links to prevention. This contributes to ending impunity as well as to ensuring victims' trust in accountable and effective criminal justice institutions. As the Secretary General reports highlights, the effects of sexual violence, including trauma, stigma, poverty, and poor health, can echo across generations. In response, we need to ensure socio-economic reintegration support to restore community cohesion. Survivors of sexual and gender-based violence also must have access to the full range of livelihood, legal, psychosocial, and medical services, including sexual and reproductive health services that are not subject to donor restrictions. Mr. President, the focus of today's open debate shows that it is a broad agenda with many interconnected goals and that no single actor can achieve them alone. This makes alliances so important between states, regional and international organizations, civil society, women's organizations, and others. We, the Security Council, need to show leadership, not only today, but across all aspects of our work. Thank you.
Le agradezco.
I thank Her Excellency, Madam Ban Kunke, for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Deputy Secretary General Mohammed, Special Representative Patton, and Ms. Sultana for your briefings today. The SRSG's report on the rising levels of conflict-related sexual violence is chilling. We welcome this discussion today and hope it serves as an impetus for this Council to take concrete steps to both ensure justice for survivors and to help prevent these crimes from occurring. Thank you, Mr. President, for convening this session today. We should all be appalled by the level of sexual violence taking place in conflicts around the world. In war zone after war zone, horrific violence against women is not an unfortunate byproduct of conflict, but a weapon of conflict. As the Secretary General's report details, and as Razia describes in horrible detail, in Burma, as we speak, the military is using sexual violence as a tool for ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya and for terrorizing other ethnic communities across the country with impunity. And what does that mean? It means using mass rape, sexual exploitation, and sexual slavery of women and girls as young as 12 or 13, to drive groups of people out of their homes. It means using the terror, stigma, and shame of rape to drive families from their country, often from the only place they've ever known. As the mother of a precious 9-year-old girl, the horror of these crimes is unfathomable. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, sexual violence is a common tactic used by armed groups to punish and humiliate people allied with their enemies. Women and girls are the battlefield on which the conflict is waged. A staggering 27% of Congolese women have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. And let's all understand why women have been targeted in so many conflicts. Because violence against women is violence against families, and violence against families is violence against whole communities. Survivors are stigmatized and isolated, families and communities ripped apart, and entire generations are left less able to find peace and reconcile their communities. Sexual violence is the poison root of societies suffering endless conflict, poverty, and dislocation. And it is for this reason that we welcome this debate. When we recognize the role of sexual violence in conflict, we recognize the link between human rights and conflict. The United States has long urged this Council to address human rights as an issue of peace and security. Debates like the one we are having today do that in a powerful and undeniable way. This linkage should be apparent to anyone who spent any time in conflict zones or the refugee camps that house the survivors. The sexual violence these survivors experience isn't random. It is calculated and designed to inflict punishment and fear in a community. Tragically, we could go on all day about the different aspects of this problem around the world, but we're here to discuss solutions. The Council has sanctions tools at its disposal to punish these heinous actors around the world, but unfortunately, they are terribly underutilized. For example, last year, former SRSG Bangura proposed names to this Council for perpetrators who should be held accountable for their crimes, but nothing has been done. It is now time for the Council to use these tools to hold perpetrators accountable for their actions. It is now time to end impunity for these criminals and show survivors and the rest of the world that the international community will respond. It is now time that member states actively develop sanctions designations for perpetrators of sexual violence and conflict. We can also designate criminals operating in conflict zones where we already have UN sanctions regimes in place. Taking these steps will not only end impunity for sexual violence and conflict, it will also help to deter future abuses. The United States also has a role to play, the United Nations also has a role to play in countering violence against women in the field through our peacekeeping missions. Women talk to each other, and more importantly, they understand each other. We should capitalize on this fundamental truth and do a better job recruiting and including more women in peacekeeping. Unfortunately, only 4% of uniformed peacekeepers are women. That number is even smaller in the most dangerous missions where women are suffering the most. Deploying more women peacekeepers will provide valuable insights that male peacekeepers often cannot obtain. However, it's not just about numbers. It's also about the roles that women peacekeepers take on. Women peacekeepers should be encouraged and empowered to engage with local communities and bring value to the work of their missions. Additionally, research shows that female participation improves dispute resolution. Women need to be at the table during peace negotiations. The United Nations should strive to include female representation in negotiating bodies and mediating teams. Finally, the UN should ensure that all peacekeeping training centers around the world include training to involve women in prevention and peace-building efforts. Without understanding the concerns of half a population, conflict can never be resolved. Sexual violence primarily affects women, but at its heart, this is an issue of human dignity. And it is an issue of how violations of human dignity, the denial of human dignity, impacts peace and security. As such, it is a vital issue of concern for this Council. Thank you once again for arranging this debate.
Le agradezco a la
I want to thank the representative of the United States for your statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the Peruvian presidency for organizing this open debate on the Women, Peace and Security agenda relating to the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence. We appreciate the Secretary General for his annual report on this topic. I would also like to thank the briefers for their respective remarks. Mr. President, conflict-related sexual violence has indeed become rampant in various conflict and post-conflict situations. We note the Secretary General's report contains useful recommendations which could form an important basis for addressing the serious challenge. The recommendation will have particular significance in the consideration of the specific conflict or post-conflict situations, and Council could explore ways and means of ensuring their implementation. The Council should encourage or pressure, as appropriate, all parties to an armed conflict to fully comply with international humanitarian law, particularly in relation to the protection of civilians. The implementation by member states of relevant regional and international legal instruments for the prevention, punishment, and eradication of all forms of violence against women will also contribute to the national, regional, and international response to victims of sexual violence. Mr. President, we note the positive progress has been registered, including through alignment of national legislation to international standards of implementation of joint communiques and action plans in several member states, as indicated in the report of the Secretary General. This notwithstanding, sexual violence continues to be used by belligerent parties in conflict and post-conflict situations in different parts of the world. Particularly, extremists and terrorist groups such as ISIL, Boko Haram, and Al-Shabaab are using it as a tactic of war to terrorize civilian population and achieve their strategic objectives. The stigmatization faced by victims of sexual violence and the challenges in their reintegration process and the impunity that the perpetrators of this heinous crime enjoy is indeed deeply troubling. Therefore, there is a need to redouble our efforts in preventing conflict-related sexual violence, in providing the necessary support to victims and fighting impunity. In this regard, the three-pillar priorities identified by SRSG pattern could serve as the basis. In addition, the recommendation of the Secretary General to the Security Council contained in his latest report, particularly in relation to engagement with relevant parties to an armed conflict, exploring the use of periodic visits to address the issue, as well as possibility of accelerated deployment of protection advisors, could form part of a comprehensive framework to preventing and addressing conflict-related sexual violence. The Council should also continue to give utmost importance to the prevention and addressing the root causes of conflict. Furthermore, measures aimed at reducing vulnerabilities of civilians, including through enhancing the capacity of peacekeeping missions, as well as using all the available tools at its disposal by the Council, will be critical. In this regard, the recommendation of the Secretary General to include sexual violence as part of a designation criteria could be explored by the Council on a case-by-case basis, particularly in the context of use of mass rape and other forms of sexual violence by extremist and terrorist groups. Mr. President, in post-conflict situation, the Council could further strengthen its peace-building efforts aimed at rebuilding national capacity and institutions, particularly the capacity of security and judiciary services to prevent and punish conflict-related sexual violence and addressing its root causes. This will enable the Council to fight impunity and bring perpetrators to justice, as well as ensure the non-occurrence of such grave crimes. We have noted from the report of the Secretary General that some of the information on incidents of conflict-related sexual violence are linked or alleged to be linked to the government-affiliated forces. In our view, such information should be communicated to the relevant authorities in a timely manner, aimed at investigating and verifying its objectivity, accuracy, and reliability. This, in our view, will contribute to the fighting impunity and provision of the necessary assistance to victims of conflict-related sexual violence and their families. Finally, Mr. President, I would like to conclude my remark by reaffirming the commitment of Ethiopia to work with all relevant actors, including the Office of the SRSG, in preventing conflict-related sexual violence and fighting impunity in this regard. I thank you.
Le agradezco a la representante.
I want to thank the representative of Ethiopia for your statement, and I give the floor to the representative of France. Mr. President, I want to start by thanking Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed, the Special Representative for the Secretary General for Sexual Violence and Conflict, Pramila Patten, for their very enlightening statements, as well as Madam Razia Sultana for her powerful statement that I think should make us all reflect on this topic. I would like to take this opportunity, Madam Special Representative, for express our wholehearted support to you and your team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence and conflict in order to implement this agenda, which is a priority for France. Now, France would like to state right from the outset that we will align ourselves with the statements made by the European Union and by Canada on behalf of the group of friends of the agenda, Women, Peace and Peace. I'm going to start with a few points that I found on issues that I find alarming before proposing a global response and several concrete opportunities to strengthen our collective action against these unacceptable acts. First of all, in spite of the efforts of the Council, we are confronted with an unacceptable situation. We're horrified by the number of sexual violence, the number of cases of sexual violence mentioned in the report of the Secretary General that includes 51 listed parties, and by the use, sometimes systematic, of sexual violence as a tactic of war, method of torture, or a tool of terror. In 19 situations examined in the report, sexual violence also often mean restrictions to the freedom of movement. That is the case in Syria, where sexual assaults are committed at crossing points and where sexual violence in besieged zones is described as systematic. The communities targeted are often forced to move and thus putting themselves in renewed vulnerability. Sometimes progress achieved has been swept away, such as in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where an increase in violence has also led to an increase in confirmed cases of sexual violence. We condemn all violence in the strongest terms, all these cases of violence in the strongest terms. International justice should be able to convict those guilty, and on here we note some progress. For example, conviction last August of Colonel Becker for war crimes, including rape committed in 2015 by soldiers in Museni in the South Kivu. We also note the end of the assimilation of rape with adultery in Afghanistan, Sudan, and Somalia. However, a great deal of progress needs to still be made. It's still unimaginable that no single individual associated with Daesh or Boko Haram has so far been convicted, even though sexual violence was used by as a tactic of war on a large scale by these groups. Furthermore, local and national mechanisms of justice, as in Somalia or South Sudan, sometimes subject the victims to a double punishment by forcing them to marry their aggressors. Madam Razia Sultana, your presentation, just as the conclusions of the visit of the Special Representative, mentioned the systematic use of sexual violence as a tactic of war in Burma to terrorize the Rohingya and make them flee. The Human Rights Council and the General Assembly have already condemned this sexual violence, and the Security Council will need to make sure that justice is served against those guilty, and that the victims are provided with due assistance. We need to collectively be extremely vigilant regarding the situation in the states of Kachin and of Shan. Mr. President, what's intolerable often finds fertile ground in a lack of tolerance. Sexual violence is often exacerbated or incited by discrimination, and particularly gender discrimination, by inequality between men and women, by prejudices and stereotypes. Even after their liberation, victims are often persecuted by these prejudices and are confronted with stigmatization. Sexual violence must therefore be combated throughout the process, starting with prevention, including rehabilitation, and up to reintegration. Support programs for victims, such as those put in place in Colombia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, or Kosovo, are very important for this. Social, legal, and medical services, including psychological and social support, as well as dialogue within communities, are extremely important on this point. This response must be quick, as demonstrated by the situation in Central African Republic, for example, where men and boys are also victims. This fight should also be seen as part of a global response to all the obstacles that are erected for the exercise of the rights of women. It's even more effective when the participation of women in decision-making is ensured and when there's a real attention focused on their economic and social empowerment. Seen from the other end, sexual violence threatens economic progress and social progress of women. For example, sometimes under threat, they're forced to give up their ownership of land. And sometimes these threats are brandished in order to restrict their political participation. France will continue to advocate for a holistic response through an effective implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, just as it did during the debate on October 27th under our presidency of the Security Council. It's not enough to express outrage. We need to act. We've been encouraged to think about this topic by the excellent concept note, to think about the issue of prevention. An effective combat against impunity is the first type of prevention. Everything must be done so that those responsible for sexual violence are prosecuted by competent national jurisdictions, and lacking that by international criminal jurisdictions, including the International Criminal Court. When prosecution is not feasible in the short run, we need to make sure that there are mechanisms that make it possible to document these crimes and make it possible to try those guilty later. In Syria, an international commission of inquiry and an international independent and impartial mechanism could play this essential role. I'd like to add furthermore that support for national authorities must go hand in hand for protective support to actors of civil society who work on a daily basis to combat sexual violence and help the victims and who are themselves targets of sometimes threatened. This council can already make concrete and more effective steps to deal with this. First of all, it could incorporate the sexual violence as a criteria for designation, both directly and indirectly, in all sanctions regime. And in particular, we need to make use of this tool much more. and we need to commit all of us to make use of this tool. Furthermore, we need to make sure that all peacekeeping missions have necessary capacities to implement their mandates. Protection of women is not an option. It's an absolute necessity that needs to be at the heart of any peacekeeping operation. The posts of gender advisors and advisors for the protection of women are extremely important and must be maintained. Lastly, this council should be in a position to weigh in more regularly on the sexual violence and conflict agenda. For example, by adopting press statements when cases of sexual violence are verified in theaters of war and crisis. Now, several UN initiatives should be commended and supported, such as that by UN Women called Justice Rapid Response, which is a real breeding ground for experts in order to support various inquiry mechanisms. More broadly, we welcome the zero-tolerance policy of the Secretary General in the face of sexual abuse and exploitation and in the face of harassment. The United Nations should set an example, and the movement of UN2, which mirrors Me Too, the Me Too movement, paves the way for concrete responses. Now, as far as France is concerned, and I'll just give a few examples, France has set up a unit for whistleblowing, training, including on the different forms of sexual violence for soldiers before their deployment, and a specific training for magistrates as well. The Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs has furthermore funded last year a project for civil society to combat against violence against women in Yemen and Nigeria, after having conducted similar projects in Central African Republic, in Cameroon, and in Lebanon. And we currently finance the establishment of a center for holistic support and care of victims of sexual violence in the Central African Republic. Mr. President, the international community, and in particular this Council, must step up their efforts in the face of these horrific and unacceptable acts. It's a top priority for France, including as part of our feminist diplomacy. My country will continue demonstrating the highest standards in this area. As the President Macron said, this is essential to maintain our dignity, and France is more than ever committed to action. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the representative of France for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Kuwait.
شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would like to thank you for holding this important debate. I would also like to thank His Excellency, the Secretary General, for his valuable report. And I would also like to thank Ms. Amina Mohammed, Ms. Pramila Patten, and Ms. Radia Sultana for their valuable briefings. Our discussion today focuses on the prevention of sexual violence in conflict through the empowerment of women, gender equality, and access to justice. And here I would like to mention three main topics. First, the link between sexual violence, conflict, and violent extremism and terrorism. Two, dealing with the root causes of sexual violence in conflicts. And three, the need for justice for the survivors of sexual violence. First, the link between sexual violence, conflicts, terrorism, and violent extremism. This year coincides with the 10th anniversary of the adoption of Resolution 1820 of the Security Council, acknowledging that sexual violence is a threat to international peace and security and requires an international response. It also acknowledged that it is being used as a war tactic, and the Secretary General's report has indicated that it is extremely violent and dangerous, that it amounts to ethnic cleansing. There are cases of such acts against the Rohingya and in the Central African Republic and elsewhere. According to Security Council resolutions 2231 and 2253, and taking into account the Council's acknowledgement that sexual violence in conflict is a war tactic and a tool of terror by certain terrorist groups and violent extremists. It also constitutes an element of economic and political terrorism that is used in recruitment and financing. The Security Council should hold accountable all the perpetrators of such crimes and put an end to their impunity. It should also promote and enhance the mandates of peacekeeping missions as well as political missions of the United Nations to include the empowerment of women in conflicts and to hold accountable the perpetrators of sexual violent crimes and refer those crimes that amount to war crimes or crimes against humanity to justice. Second, the root causes of sexual violence in conflicts. Last year, we have all witnessed a retreat by certain terrorist armed groups, creating challenges in the liberated areas, including the necessity for accountability for sexual violence and the reintegration of the survivors. Sexual violence is used as a means to force the population to leave their lands, to exploit women and girls, even by responsibles in refugee camps, and the impunity that the perpetrators have all enjoyed perpetuates these crimes. We agree with the United Nations, with the Secretary General, that the best way to prevent sexual violence is to promote basic freedoms, human rights, economic empowerment, and political participation, as well as building national capacities in this regard and assist the survivors of sexual violence, particularly women and girls. At the regional level, we have hosted the International Conference on the Reconstruction of Iraq, and we have announced our contribution of $1 billion in the form of loans and investments, proceeding from our belief of its necessity to rehabilitate the areas liberated from the ISIL terrorist group, as well as to achieve sustainable development for all, particularly women and girls, national reconciliation, and social justice. Three, the consequences of sexual violence on the survivors. We attach particular importance to this issue, and we have seen that a solid set of criteria has developed over the years, beginning with Resolution 1820, as well as other related resolutions such as 1988, establishing the position of the Special Representative of the Secretary General, and the improvement of coordination amongst all entities concerned, as well as Resolution 1960, establishing a mechanism to monitor and report sexual violence. We support the cooperation between the United Nations Initiative to prevent sexual violence in conflicts and the member states, with a view to enabling the survivors to be reintegrated, to grant them access to justice, and to provide them with the psychological, physical, and social assistance that they need. The root causes of sexual violence are many, and so are its forms and survivors. Granting justice for the survivors will help in dealing with the short and long-term psychological, physical, economic, and social consequences of such sexual violence. And we stress the importance of dealing with the survivors as victims and not as members of armed groups or terrorist groups. This also requires reinforcing national capacities of the member states dealing with these crimes. Mr. President, while we speak of the importance of granting justice to the survivors, we would not fail to welcome the steps taken by the Secretary General of the United Nations in the implementation of zero tolerance for sexual violence. And we take note of the special measures taken on the protection from sexual violence and exploitation mentioned in the Secretary General's report as well. The United Nations commitment to these measures will enhance its credibility and serve our collective efforts. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Kuwait for that statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the plurinational state of Bolivia. Thank you, Mr. President. Sexual violence in conflict involves a series of crimes against humanity with devastating consequences which are irreversible for victims. It's necessary that the Security Council address this issue more regularly, and for that reason we would thank the Presidency of Peru for the initiative of convening this session. We would also like to thank Madam Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, for her leadership shown in making this topic more visible. We'd also like to thank Madam Pramila Patten, Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, and Madam Razia Sultana for their reports at this time. Mr. President, Bolivia believes that sexual violence in conflict is one of the most heinous acts against humanity, because its emotional and physical consequences continue to affect the survivors long after the conflicts are over. It is a problem which the international community must tackle in a united manner, coordinating efforts in order to implement measures at the national, regional, and international levels. Over the last 18 years, the Security Council has been developing a series of resolutions in order to provide a comprehensive response to sexual violence in conflicts, which clearly is a serious threat to international security and a real impediment to the achievement of peace in countries which are victims of armed conflict. Despite these resolutions, sexual violence in conflict continues to be a cruel reality in the daily lives of millions of people around the world. It is imperative that the Security Council be firm in compliance of its resolutions in fighting against sexual conflict and violence by promoting accountability and implementing a zero-tolerance policy. We also believe that the Secretary General's suggestions in his most recent report are on the right path, especially including sexual violence as part of the criteria for designating sanctions, and that committees should have information from a gender expert and one that is an expert on sexual violence in conflict. Without any distinction of gender, sexual violence in conflicts affects girls and women in the majority who are subject to rape, sexual slavery, prostitution, forced sterilization, and marriage. And trafficking of persons is another form of violence with terrible consequences physically and psychologically for the victims. And very often they receive protection and do not receive the protection and assistance they need and are disenfranchised and rejected by their own communities. We agree with the Secretary General that it's very alarming that the use of sexual violence is as a tactic of war and terrorism, and with this understanding, the international community needs to work together to provide support to national initiatives which are focused on reinsertion into society of the survivors and their children so that they can fully enjoy their rights. Also, the increase in risk of sexual violence in refugee camps and during displacement and travel is another challenge that the international community must grapple with. Insecurity during displacement, a lack of access to basic services for refugees, protracted conflicts which impede the safe return are all difficult conditions which millions of people have to live in currently. An example of this would be the situation on the border between Myanmar and Bangladesh. And we'd like to take this opportunity to highlight the goodwill of Bangladesh to provide refuge to the Rohingya people, and we encourage Myanmar to continue working with the United Nations to ensure the sustainable, dignified, voluntary, and safe return of the displaced. We believe that empowerment of women as a preventative measure, access to justice and accountability are all key aspects of fighting sexual violence. But it is clear that in order to promote this, we must first address the root causes of conflicts, remove structural inequalities, combat extreme poverty, and eradicate discrimination and that patriarchal systems have left entrenched in societies that prevent women from developing with freedom and have access to justice. Prevention is a very important tool that the Secretary General has been promoting in the last year. To prevent, it is absolutely necessary to increase cooperation between the United Nations and civil society in order to have access to more specific and precise information that would make it possible to conduct a more reliable analysis of the situation. Mr. President, it's vital to promote participation of women in processes of peace, security, and development, and to include in the content of agreements, specific content on inclusion of women, fighting sexual violence, and the elimination of impunity. The political empowerment of women should be promoted by states through specific concrete measures that then transform the conditions of abuse and discrimination in which women live. Minorities also have to live under these conditions, as well as rural populations. A good example of legal and constitutional transformation in favor of women was provided by Afghanistan in working with its implementation of its National Action Plan for Afghan women, which shows encouraging progress despite the fact that there are still some very important challenges to be met. Also, the very close collaboration between regional organizations is of extreme importance. Last year, the Deputy Secretary General visited Nigeria and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and that was very significant for the joint efforts of the United Nations and the African Union in this regard. This type of rapprochement is very important in order to be able to implement the Gender, Peace, and Security Program on the African continent, and it's also important for strengthening existing mechanisms. We would also highlight the creation of the hybrid court in South Sudan that was established by a peace agreement led by the African Union and with technical support provided by the United Nations. Despite the time it's taking to get this initiative off the ground, it is an initiative cooperation that we should encourage. Having said all that, Mr. President, we believe that we have good tools available to continue with our struggle against sexual violence. There are still many challenges before us, and this is why the commitment of the Security Council and the United Nations system should be even stronger. Thank you very much, sir. I thank the representative of Bolivia for that statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Thank you, Mr. President. We commend Peru for convening this important debate. Poland aligns itself with the statement to be delivered by the representative of the European Union. Mr. President, I would like to thank Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohamed for her remarks. I thank also the Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Ms. Pamela Patton, for her comprehensive briefing. We highly value your tireless and dedicated work. Ms. Razia Sultana, we are honored by your presence with us here today, and we deeply appreciate your moving and inspirational testimony on behalf of the Rohingya women and girls who have suffered from sexual violence. Your voice as civil society is important for all of us to hear. Mr. President, we are outraged by the persistent and widespread sexual violence in armed conflicts. As it has been noted by many speakers, sexual violence is increasingly used as a tactic of warfare and constitutes a flagrant and unacceptable violation of international humanitarian and human rights law. We are all aware that the already staggering numbers of reported cases of sexual violence in conflict represent a mere fraction of the true number. one of the biggest challenges its victims are facing is lack of accountability of the perpetrators for committed crimes. Mr. President, the recent report of the Secretary General highlighted various challenges we face in addressing conflict-related sexual violence. Allow me to emphasize 3 areas that need our particular attention today. First, economic empowerment. We welcome the focus of this year's report on economic empowerment as a tool to eliminate conflict-related sexual violence. Poverty and social exclusion are risk factors associated with gender-based violence. Economic empowerment of women means ensuring proper funding for programs that address the economic and social needs of survivors, as well as putting in place initiatives to change the conditions that allow violence to occur in the first place. Furthermore, we believe there is a need for a broader discussion in the Security Council of the importance of women's economic empowerment in post-conflict settings, in more general terms. Peacebuilding and recovery funding still largely ignore women's economic role. Mr. President, let me now turn to the question of stigmatization of victims of sexual violence. Beyond the cruelty of sexual violence and its consequences, the victims are still too often stigmatized and rejected by their families and communities. Wanting to escape the stigma and discrimination, the majority of victims do not report rape and other forms of sexual violence. It does not only contribute to the culture of impunity, but it also prevents survivors of sexual violence from accessing medical care and legal assistance. We support the Secretary General's call on traditional, religious, and community leaders to address harmful social norms and contribute to redirecting the stigma of rape from victims to perpetrators. In particular, we want to draw the attention to the social stigma of children conceived through rape. Women with children born of sexual violence are the most marginalized. Children born of rape are often ostracized by families and communities. Children living on the margins of societies are not only deprived of fundamental human rights, but are at the higher risk of being recruited by armed groups and organized crime groups, and those pose a direct threat to peace and security. Mr. President, my third point relates to the sexual violence against men and boys in armed conflicts. We welcome the attention paid to this question in the Secretary General's report. Devastating impacts of sexual violence on male survivors and their families need to be discussed openly at this forum. The great reluctance of many men and boys to report sexual violence makes it very difficult to accurately assess its scope. The limited statistics that exist almost certainly vastly understate the number of male victims. For male survivors, sexual violence remains hidden in cultural taboos. Hesitancy of male survivors to speak about sexual violence leads to even greater impunity for those crimes. We urge the states to remove any structural and legal obstacles that prevent the investigation and prosecution of rape and other forms of sexual violence committed against men and boys. Mr. President, the latest Secretary General report leaves no doubt that we cannot spare any effort in combating the sexual violence. Only by shedding light on this can we lift the long shadow of sexual violence in conflict for all the survivors and prevent it from happening in the future. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Poland for that statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank you for organizing today's meeting and also express our gratitude to the briefers who have been invited for their very interesting and useful information. In particular, I'd like to thank Razia Sultana for the very interesting information in her briefing, and I very much hope that the course of the upcoming trip to Myanmar by members of the Security Council will be taking part in that delegation. We hope to be able to find out more about this topic. Now, in the course of the almost 10-year period since the Security Council has begun to take an active interest in the issue of sexual violence and conflict, a lot has been achieved. First of all, there is a broad recognition has been reached that sexual violence is a serious challenge rather than some sort of a collateral and secondary manifestation of separate, although unhealthy instincts which are compounded by a situation of armed conflict. There's no doubt for us that sexual violence is a consequence of conflict, including due to the impunity of those who commit such crimes, which is why to fully put an end to put an end to sexual violence once and for all and all other types of violence against civilians can only be done by resolving armed conflicts through peaceful means and in eradicating their root causes. Traditionally, we have supported the work of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on sexual violence and conflict. In particular, we highly value your work aimed at strengthening national capacity, developing dialogue with religious and other traditional leaders, in dealing with the problem of the stigmatization of victims of sexual violence and their rehabilitation. Unfortunately, it has not been possible so far to defeat the evil of violence, and particularly we're concerned about information about the increase in the number of crimes pertaining to sexual violence by members of terrorist groups. We call on states to cooperate more actively in dismantling the so-called shadow economy of ISIL, which makes profits by, for example, being involved in trafficking of people and sexual slavery. We hope that these crimes will be effectively documented and investigated, and of course this falls within the remit of the authorities of the states where those crimes are committed, first and foremost. Mr. President, we'd also like to focus on a number of separate provisions contained in today's report. Although we share most of its recommendations and conclusions, I would like to draw your attention to a number of alarming aspects. First of all, just as a general comment, to effectively achieve the goals set for the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Madam Patton, she should strictly adhere to her mandate. She should not distract or dilute her efforts and resources in dealing with the issue of gender equality as a whole, or with migration and violence against women per se. That doesn't mean that these problems aren't important. They are, but they are not reflected in her mandate. The focus of attention should be the situations of armed conflict, and in particular those where sexual violence has acquired a particularly mass character. Now, also, it's not the first time we're seriously concerned by attempts to broadly interpret the scope of the mandate of the Security Council in combating sexual violence and conflict. By using another term, that is conflict-related sexual violence. Now, as we see it, what may at first sight seem to be a simple technical inconsistency, in fact, this threatens having the Security Council stray from its main terms of reference and interfere in the mandate of other UN bodies. It's important to strictly delineate sexual violence as a military crime, a war crime, and a similar crimes of a more general nature. We'd also like to comment on another trend, and that is the increasing shift in focus in the report on human rights issues. We'd like to just remind you that sexual violence and conflict is first and foremost a violation of international humanitarian law. This is precisely why not only government structures, but non-government participants of armed conflicts are duty-bound to comply with norms aimed at to combat sexual violence. And we should monitor this on a systemic basis. And lastly, what's most important, this year there are what we're seeing is unhealthy attempts to use the issue of sexual violence and conflict to further narrow political aims. This in particular was reflected in the country section of the report. In particular, in the chapter on Syria, the issue of crimes by ISIL fighters and by other terrorist organizations is kind of barely mentioned. The evaluations and the figures are shown in such a way that you need to extrapolate in order to get the full picture. How should we interpret this? How will the fighters and terrorists react to this lack of courage? Might they not think that their crimes are actually escaping the attention of the international community and that they can continue? At the same time, not a word is mentioned about the significant change in the security situation in Syria as a whole, and the fact that most of the territory of the country has been cleansed of terrorists, or the fact that due to the complex and thorough work, a large, significant number of peaceful civilians have been freed from the hands of the fighters, and a significant share of that civilian population are women and children, including those who were victims of sexual violence and abuse. For example, just in the territory of eastern Ghouta during the most active phase of fighting, some 165,000 people have been liberated. We are convinced that an approach that is too biased, or where objective realities are not mentioned in the report, all this will only undermine the work of the special representative and lower the effectiveness of her work in combating sexual violence in conflict. Mr. President, also, we'd like to underscore separately that the policy of zero tolerance, which is welcomed in the report, should not be applied based on the principle of ours and theirs. It is unacceptable that that national peacekeeping contingents that are acting under a UN mandate should be freed of their responsibility for committing certain actions, or those who are working, or representatives of NGOs working in certain countries. We would like to just recall in this connection that Paris has kind of tried to sweep under the carpet the examination of cases of sexual violence, including violence against children by French soldiers during the conduct of the operation of Sangaris in the Central African Republic. In spite of the fact that the investigation was supposedly carried out, based on all reports, no one was punished. This can only cause outrage. There are also other cases where the policy of double standards is applied. For example, in considering the draft resolution on extending the mandate of the United Nations mission in support of justice in Haiti, the delegation of the United States refused to enshrine the need to report on all accusations of sexual violence by NGOs that are representatives of NGOs that are accredited with the United Nations. Mr. President, In conclusion, I would like to state that we are not losing hope that the measures adopted in the UN, including debates such as the one today, will contribute to the goal of the elimination of sexual and all other forms of violence against civilians in the course of armed conflict, and ultimately will contribute to resolving conflicts for the benefit of international peace and security. Thank you.
Le agradezco.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for that statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Côte d'Ivoire. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I would like to congratulate your country, Peru, for having put this important matter of sexual violence related to conflict around the world on the program of work under your presidency. Mr. President, the Ivorian delegation would like to thank Madam Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations, for her report of the Secretary General's report on the question of sexual violence in conflict around the world. We should also like to extend our gratitude to Madam Pramila Patten, Under Secretary General and Special Representative of the Secretary General responsible for the question of sexual violence committed in conflict, and Madam Razia Sultana, Senior Researcher of Caledon Press. I'd like to thank all of these ladies for their presentations. And we'd like to thank Madam Sultana for the significant information that she shared with us on the situation of women in Myanmar. Mr. President, the issue before us this morning provides an opportunity to the Security Council to once again debate the problem of the significant role of women in the peace and security agenda around the world. My country is of the view, along with the experts in this matter, that sexual violence as a weapon of war is a serious attack on the physical and moral integrity of the victims, and is a serious breach of the moral values of a given society. Indeed, women and girls who live in zones that are prone to instability are impacted in an alarming manner by sexual violence and sexism. This violence is generally perpetrated with a clear goal of altering the identity and the dignity of the victims. It has disastrous consequences physically, psychologically, and economically for these women, as well as repercussions on peace and social cohesion. As indicated in the Secretary General's report on sexual violence in conflict, published in document S/2018/250, as indicated in the Secretary General's report, sexual violence is used by the belligerent parties as a strategy of war and terrorism against communities. It is increasingly an activity which is lucrative and fuels conflict and terrorism. Indeed, rape, which is often collective in nature, along with sexual slavery, forced prostitution, and many other forms of sexual violence, have proven, unfortunately, to be tactics used in order to compel people or force entire communities to flee their place of residence and leave behind them their assets to the profit of the aggressors. This situation is alarming and is a grave violation of human rights and international humanitarian law, and therefore justifies dynamic and energetic measures be taken by the international community and the Security Council in order to grapple with this challenge. And in this regard, it's important to reference the relevant provisions of the Security Council Resolution 1820 of the year 2008, which recognizes sexual violence as a crime and a war tactic that requires an appropriate security response. I should also recall here provisions of Resolution 2331 of the Council, which establishes a clear link between the trafficking of human beings, sexual violence, and terrorism, and at the same time calls for measures which would include psychological, medical, and legal measures be taken in the context of providing the reparations to which victims have a right. Côte d'Ivoire remains convinced that an appropriate response to the problem of sexual violence in conflict must include strengthened participation of women in collective efforts to bring about peace and to build peace, because as underscored in Resolution 1325, women are strong contributors to peacekeeping and building in their communities and in their nations. In this regard, it remains essential to increase our efforts to promote inclusion, leadership, and the protection of women, with a view to guaranteeing social cohesion and lasting peace. Mr. President, Côte d'Ivoire, after the post-electoral crisis that it experienced from 2010 to 2011, was in March 2012 put on the list annexed to the Secretary General's report on sexual violence in conflict. Côte d'Ivoire was delisted on the 15th of April 2017 in light of positive progress made in the country in the areas of stability and peace building. This conclusion is the result of major efforts undertaken by the Ivorian government, which, as soon as the crisis came to an end, made the fight against sexual violence a priority. And it did so by putting in place, in addition to the existing legal provisions, a national strategy to fight violence, which is gender-based. To fight this scourge, a national committee was established by decree to fight sexual violence in conflict, and it is geared to strengthening the regulatory framework by putting in place specific provisions relating to repression of rape. Likewise, the fact that the government took ownership of this effort at the highest level of the upper ranks of the Côte d'Ivoire Armed Forces clearly showed the relevance of this in fighting this scourge. Indeed, this ownership led to a number of things, including specific commitments undertaken at the upper echelons of command to train personnel on the whole problem of sexual violence. Henceforth, matters of sexual violence, both in periods of peace and in period of conflict, are part and parcel of training modules for the instruction offices and military academies in Côte d'Ivoire. The code of conduct of the Côte d'Ivoire Armed Forces was overhauled and particularly stresses crimes that are related to sexual violence. Moreover, recruiting of women to high-level posts in sectors that heretofore had been reserved only for men, especially in the area of defense, has contributed to improving the effectiveness of the approach adopted by the government in order to grapple with this scourge. Thus, following implementation of the government strategy and other initiatives, such as a number of different sessions that were held for the purposes of awareness raising and training, documented sexual violence cases have gone from 478 cases in 2012 to 30 cases in 2014, and further dropped to 3 cases in 2015, and finally to 0 cases in 2017. My country commends the synergy of actions undertaken between the Ivorian government and the United Nations systems that's reflected in the implementation in 2017 of the joint mechanisms, Ivorian Armed Forces and ONUSI, which is the United Nations operation in Côte d'Ivoire, the purpose of which is follow-up on violations of human rights. Moreover, this very good collaboration also led to technical assistance being provided by a United Nations team of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence in conflict in the context of the Côte d'Ivoire Armed Forces Action Plan. Implementing this action plan led to a number of results, including the creation of specialized police units. Due to all of these efforts, the armed forces of Côte d'Ivoire are, at this time, the only and first entity to be delisted from the Secretary General's annex of his report on sexual violence in conflict. Moreover, implementation in 2012 of the National Program for Social Cohesion, which includes a gender dimension and an opening dimension. This is a plan that was put in place between 2015 and 2017 and included 6 posts dedicated to peace building by women. These are posts occupied by women in the west and central western regions of the country, which in the past had been very harshly affected by conflict. And this approach has had a major impact in providing psychosocial support for victims of sexual violence and conflict. Notwithstanding this important progress achieved, my country remains aware of the challenges that remain. In this instance, the rather sensitive issue of reparations for sexual violence committed during the post-electoral crisis. Côte d'Ivoire would like to reaffirm here its determination to conclude investigations into cases already discovered and to support the victims, especially through actions undertaken and led by the Ministry of Women, Protection of Children, and Solidarity. Also, in the context of prevention and deterrence of new forms that sexual violence might take in times of peace, the Ivorian government intends to continue these efforts and to make it a priority, and to continue with the policy of zero tolerance, which is currently in place in both the Ivorian security and defense forces. I could not conclude my remarks without reiterating my country's gratitude to the Special Representative of the Secretary General of the United Nations, who is responsible for questions relating to sexual violence in conflict, and her team. We'd like to thank them for their excellent work and efforts to accompany the Ivorian government in its efforts to fight this phenomenon. Côte d'Ivoire reaffirms not only its full availability and willingness to share its experiences, but also its openness to receiving lessons learned from successes elsewhere, and to strengthen the resilience of its people through improvement of the existing legal and institutional frameworks, and better addressing issues that are related to gender-based sexual violence. In this regard, my country commends the mission of sharing experiences and lessons learned that it will be undertaking with Colombia in June. This effort will benefit from the support of the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General, with a view to inspiring successful experiences of the country and specifically focusing on indemnization of victims and reparations for victims of sexual violence and conflict. Thank you, sir. I thank the representative of Côte d'Ivoire, says the president, and I now give the floor to the representative of Kazakhstan.
Mr. President, Kazakhstan thanks the Peruvian presidency for highlighting the need to prevent conflict-related sexual violence through empowerment, gender equality, and access to justice. We commend the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed, for presenting so succinctly the key aspects of the Secretary General's report, and Special Representative Pramila Patten on the important work of her office. We also thank Ms. Razia Sultana for her passionate and informative and yet horrifying analysis of the situation with sexual violence against Rohingya women and the other ethnic female groups in Myanmar. Kazakhstan supports the findings of the Secretary General's annual report and recommendations. Despite the robust normative framework and the progress achieved, conflict-related sexual violence remains at alarmingly high levels. What is more troubling, sexual violence is aggravated by human trafficking and is used as a tactic of war and source of income by armed groups, terrorist organizations, and transnational organized crime networks. This scourge, therefore, requires concerted and well-coordinated cross-national interventions with one UN approach. All efforts of the UN action and team of experts require improved coordination with UNODC, Interpol, regional and sub-regional organizations, and initiatives such as African Women Leaders Network in the areas of prevention, information sharing and documentation, assistance to victims, training of security forces, legal assistance, and exchange of good practices in combating sexual violence. It is also crucial to bring women to the negotiating table at the highest levels and emphasize the responsibility of host governments and regional organizations to provide the momentum. The state has the primary responsibility for enacting legislation to respond to sexual violence and strengthening the law enforcement and criminal justice system, in addition to increasing the representation of women in the military and police services. National legislative responses around the world should be harmonized and made compatible with UN standards. We commend the team of experts for its continuing technical assistance to member states and call on the international community to ensure necessary funding for the team. The Security Council's and UN's high-level field visits, such as AU-UN joint mission to the African countries led by Deputy Secretary General in July 2017, are important to create awareness on the women, peace and security agenda and should become a regular practice. Sexual violence affects every aspect of a survivor's life. The Secretary General's report underscores that conflict-related sexual violence leads to the stigmatization of victims, devastation of physical and economic security, especially of displaced, minority, and rural women. Therefore, as Mrs. Razia Sultana so eloquently has argued, the victims should receive full, competent, and speedy attention with increased access to healthcare, psychological support, legal assistance, and socio-economic reintegration with improved camp management. We must support the safe, voluntary, and sustainable return of displaced populations and the refugees. Cooperation with religious leaders, civil society, and local communities is most important in order to change extremist narratives, shift the stigma of sexual violence from the victims to perpetrators, promote education, and create awareness on the empowerment of women. Often, the entire community needs healing, and so this must be given full attention in truth and reconciliation commissions and transitional justice. We absolutely agree with all briefers today and Secretary General's report that international community should ensure accountability for all cases of sexual violence in conflict and bring a resolute end to impunity. State and non-state parties to the conflict must be pressured to comply with international law. States need to work with UN Security Council sanctions committees, which must include, where appropriate, sexual violence as designated criteria for sanctions against individuals and organized networks. We strongly believe that preventing sexual exploitation and abuse by the peacekeepers should be an absolute priority with zero tolerance for such offenses. Peacekeeping missions need to have the protection of civilians, especially women and girls, as a fundamental element in their mandates, with the greater recruitment of women military and police officers. Besides that, all troops and police contingents should have full training prior to and during deployment. We support the deployment of women's protection advisors to peacekeeping missions, with ensured long-term and sustainable funding for their work. Kazakhstan integrates the WPS agenda in its national legislation, formulating new strong pro-women policies that will guarantee women's engagement in decision-making at all levels in the political and economic life of the country. Training on gender equality for the armed and security forces and women's deployment in US peacekeeping operations are also a priority. At the regional level, we are focusing on Afghanistan with a multi-dimensional approach of conflict prevention and resolution, recovery, reintegration, accompanied by humanitarian and development assistance through strengthening the security and development nexus. Kazakhstan has launched, in cooperation with Japan and UNDP, a project for gender equality in Afghanistan, also focusing on providing policy support and capacity development. At the international level, we are contributing to the UN Trust Fund to end violence against women that funds projects in the post-conflict settings. To conclude, we are ready to work with the international community in every multilateral action to promote the central elements of Agenda 2030 and the new agenda for peace related to gender empowerment. I thank you.
Le agradezco al representante de
I want to thank the representative of Kazakhstan for your statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And as a number of speakers have noted today, the United Charter makes clear that the United Nations itself was established to protect the dignity and worth of the human person. And therefore, Mr. President, we join other colleagues in thanking you for calling this debate today. Mr. President, I really do appeal to all speakers not to politicize this. This is one of the worst things we face in modern times. And I think it behoves all of us, Mr. President, to treat the debate as a common problem which we are all committed to mitigating and eventually eradicating. For the avoidance of doubt, let me say incredibly clearly, the United Kingdom salutes the courage both of Ms. Sultana for your fantastic work, and I'm very glad that we've had the chance to hear this before the Security Council undertakes a mission to Bangladesh and Myanmar, but also to the SRSG for your efforts and for the very comprehensive report that you have given us today. Mr. President, a lot of people want to speak, so I will be brief. I think it's really good that so many members of the UN want to speak. Like others, we are committed to preventing, but also responding to sexual violence in conflict. We began a Preventing Sexual Violence initiative some years ago, and that showed how central tackling sexual violence is to conflict prevention and peace building. 5 years on from the global summit that launched this campaign, the United Kingdom plans to hold an international meeting in 2019 to maintain a global focus, and we look forward to working very closely with everybody in the chamber today to achieve our common goals. Mr. President, I do agree with our Russian colleague that sexual violence is one of those violations of IHL that applies also to non-state actors, and I think that's incredibly important. We have the UNGA Declaration of 2013. We also have a 2013 G8 Declaration on preventing sexual violence in conflict, and I hope that as work progresses on this, we might be able to build on those two important documents. I'd like to focus today, if I may, on 3 specific issues. The first is the importance of education, particularly girls' education. Women and girls are disproportionately affected by sexual violence in conflict, as we've heard from many people, including the last speaker and the Côte d'Ivoirian ambassador. This is not to detract from the point that men and boys can also be victims, but it is women and girls who suffer most. So by extension, creating a global environment where gender equality and women's rights exist and discriminatory attitude, behaviours and practices do not, will obviously help that goal. The British Foreign Secretary has set a personal target for the British diplomacy of helping other countries achieve 12 years of quality education for all girls globally, and we are investing our development assistance in girls' education, as we know it contributes to a safer, more prosperous world, reduces conflict and increases stability. Secondly, survivors' stigma. The Polish representative very eloquently set this out, so I will not repeat that, Mr. President, but just to say that we completely agree with the focus he put on this area. The UK-led Principles for Global Action on Tackling Stigma of Sexual Violence is a practical guide which we have drawn up to raise awareness among policymakers of the challenges, and we really do hope that the principles can be applied in all contexts where sexual violence has occurred. Finally, Mr. President, justice and accountability. Again, other speakers have referred to this. The survivors of sexual violence and children born through rape must receive justice for what has happened to them. This is a critical element of our prevention efforts. There has been some important progress, for example, at the Kavumu trial in DRC late last year, when 11 Congolese militia members were convicted of crimes against humanity for murder and rape against 37 young children. But there is much more to be done. Although ISIL and Kosovo are not mentioned in the report, there continues to be a gap in justice and accountability for sexual violence cases from those conflicts. In closing, Mr. President, can I say that we join others in urging all member states to implement the International Protocol on the documentation, investigation of sexual violence in conflict. This provides guidance on achieving accountability for this truly abhorrent crime, which we are all pledged to tackle. Thank you very much.
Le agradezco a la representante del Reino.
I'd like to thank the representative of the United Kingdom for your statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, China thanks the Peruvian presidency for the initiative to convene today's open debate. I'd like to thank Deputy Secretary General Ms. Amina Mohammed and SISG Ms. Patton for their briefings. China also listened to the statement of the civil society representative. The current international security situation remains complex and challenging, marked by armed conflicts occurring from time to time and terrorists running amok. In some countries and territories, people still live in the shadow of war and conflict. Vulnerable groups, such as women and girls, bearing the brunt of such instability, fall victim to sexual violence in armed conflicts. China strongly condemns and firmly opposes the use of sexual violence as a tactic of war and any act of sexual violence against women and girls. The international community is duty-bound to take comprehensive measures and effectively strengthen their cooperation to address this issue. First, it is necessary to promote the peaceful resolution of armed conflicts, to root out the breeding ground for sexual violence in conflict. The international community should remain on the path towards political settlement of hotspot issues through diplomatic means and towards peaceful settlement of disputes through negotiation, good offices, and mediation. The Council resolutions in respect of women, peace, and security should be implemented in real earnest. At each stage of the peace process, women's unique advantage should be leveraged and their safety and security concerns addressed to guarantee women's right to full participation and their entitlement to decision-making power. Second, vigorous support is required for the countries concerned to help them strengthen their capacity building, to shore up protection through stabilization, and to promote equality through development, thus effectively safeguarding the rights and interests of women. Countries concerned shoulder the primary responsibility for preventing and combating sexual violence in conflict and protecting their own women and children. The international community should respect the sovereignty and will of the countries concerned, respect the measures taken by their governments in the context of their national realities, and actively provide these countries with constructive assistance in order to enhance their capacity building in the areas of security, economy, governance, and so on, so as to help raise the status of women and fully realize women's empowerment. Third, we must resolutely crack down on terrorism and transnational organized crime. The international community should act firmly to put an end to the horrific acts of terrorist and extremist forces that harm women and children. Closely integrate the elimination of sexual violence and conflict with the fight against terrorism, uphold uniform standards of counterterrorism, and strengthen coordination at the international level. The countries concerned should scale up cooperation in border control and law enforcement to provide a safe environment and a dignifying social climate for the terrorized victims of sexual violence. Fourth, it is necessary to ensure that all relevant UN bodies work in synergy. The Security Council should fulfill its primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security and coordinate better with the UN General Assembly, the ECOSOC, the Peacebuilding Commission, and UN Women. So these bodies can work together to address these issues in such areas as women, peace, and security within the purview of their respective mandates and expertise. In addition, cooperation with relevant regional, sub-regional organizations should also be strengthened so they can leverage their expertise and unique advantages to create a favorable environment in which women and girls can live and thrive. China stands ready to continue working with the rest of the international community to create a peaceful, safe, and stable international environment and make greater contributions to the early elimination of sexual violence in conflict and to the continued development of the global women's cause. I thank you, Mr. President.
I'd like to thank the representative of China for your statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Netherlands.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. And I'd like to start by thanking the Deputy Secretary General, Ms. Amina Mohammed, SRSG Pramila Patton, and Mrs. Raiza Sultana for their pertinent briefings. And I also wish to express our sincere gratitude to Peru for organizing this important debate. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself fully with the statement to be made by the European Union and by the group of Friends of Women, Peace and Security. Mr. President, the Secretary General's report and today's testimonies by our briefers describe in no uncertain terms the gruesome and widespread prevalence of sexual violence in both conflict-affected and post-conflict settings. The mere fact that the report covers 1/10 of the UN membership is disturbing in itself. Mr. President, please allow me to focus on 3 important aspects. First, the plight of the Rohingya in Myanmar. Second, the fight against sexual exploitation and abuse. And thirdly, the course of action to stop impunity. Mr. President, the Kingdom of the Netherlands adds its voice to that of today's civil society briefer, Ms. Raisa Sultana, in condemning, in the strongest terms, the cruelty that Rohingya women and girls have faced both before and after fleeing their homes in Rakhine State. We cannot remain silent on the injustice done and the trauma inflicted on these women and girls and their community at large. It is upsetting that now, after Syria and the DRC, a state actor has once again been listed as being credibly suspected or responsible for sexual violence in a situation of armed conflict. This demands a concerted response from the international community to bring justice and rehabilitation to the victims of this violence. Mr. President, there is a mosaic on the 3rd floor of this building that reads, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." And that brings me to my second point. While the report looks primarily at sexual violence inflicted by armed groups and state actors, we cannot ignore cases of sexual exploitation and abuse or sexual harassment committed by those working for or associated with the United Nations. The Kingdom of the Netherlands reaffirms its total commitment to the UN's zero-tolerance policy on sexual exploitation and abuse and on sexual harassment. It is rightfully gaining the attention and visibility it deserves. Masculine-dominated cultures often create obstacles to upholding zero-tolerance policies. But, like the Secretary General, we are determined to remove those obstacles and work towards true gender equality. Also, by including women and gender perspective in prevention, peacekeeping, and conflict resolution, we can diminish sexual violence in conflict, as well as sexual exploitation and abuse. Mr. President, my third point is on the course of action to stop impunity. And I would like to echo the words of SRSG Pramila Patten: sexual violence is avoidable. The very first recommendation that the Secretary General makes to the Security Council in his report is to include sexual violence as a part of the designation criteria for sanctions. Sanctions are a tool that could be more effectively used to deter sexual violence and to coerce and constrain the individuals involved. They have the potential to protect the safety and lives of millions of women and girls, as well as boys and men living in conflict areas. The recent inclusion of this criterion in the sanctions regime for the Central African Republic is a welcome development, and this needs to be taken up more consistently. We call on this Council to systematically and explicitly incorporate and apply sexual violence as a designation criterion in sanctions regimes, particularly in those regimes targeting the actors listed in the report. For those conflict-affected countries for which no specific UN sanctions regime exists yet, we urge the Council to consider the adoption of targeted sanctions regimes that would allow for the inclusions of a specific designation criterion on sexual violence. Mr. President, ultimately, sanctions cannot be an alternative to prosecution or crimes that are punishable under international law. It is first and foremost up to member states to ensure the prosecution of perpetrators and to facilitate reparations under international humanitarian law. Furthermore, it is up to member states to guarantee survivors access to all legal, psychosocial, as well as medical services, including safe abortion, emergency contraception, and HIV treatment. Strengthening the capacity of national institutions is critical to ensure accountability for past crimes, as well as prevention and deterrence for the future. In this context, we recognize the work of the team of experts in building national capacities to enhance accountability for conflict-related sexual violence. If, however, national governments prove to be unable or unwilling, this Council should revert to other means and channels, such as the International Criminal Court, to make sure both state and non-state parties comply with their obligations under international law. Mr. President, let me end by reiterating our strong support for the work of Secretary General Special Representative Pramila Patten and the vision she has articulated since assuming office last year. Thank you very much.
I want to thank the representative of the Netherlands for her statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Equatorial Guinea. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, we'd like to begin our statement on behalf of Equatorial Guinea by saying that we align ourselves with a statement that will be made by Madam Fatima Kiari Mohammed on behalf of the Observer Mission of the African Union. I want to thank the Presidency of Peru through Ambassador Cuadro Velasquez for organizing this very necessary debate as we commemorate the 10th anniversary of Resolution 1820 of 2008, which established sexual violence and conflict as an item on the agenda of the Security Council. I would like to also thank Mrs. Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General, Mrs. Pramila Patten, Special Representative of Secretary General on Violence and Conflict, and Mrs. Rasia Sultana for their informative and alarming presentations and their commitment to their work. Their presentations give us more context on issue of sexual violence and armed conflict, and they actually represent an effective and urgent appeal for the need for peace, security, and sustainable development. Mr. President, since this is the first intervention of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea on this very important topic, we would like to first state that Equatorial Guinea unequivocally deplores sexual violence, whether in armed conflict or in peace, as well as the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war. We believe that this is one of the worst assaults on human dignity, and we share the deep concern that all members of this council feel regarding the growing trend of these unacceptable actions around the world. In the last report of the Secretary General on the period from January to December 2017, we note progress in some of the efforts aimed at preventing and also providing a response to sexual violence and armed conflict and in post-conflict situations in areas of special concern. This in particular through investment in human resources and information, and through policies, proactive policies, and also through the efforts of various structures within this organization. We'd like to in particular commend the exceptional work of the group of experts on the rule of law and sexual violence and conflict, the United Nations Network Against Sexual Violence and Conflict, the appointment of a defender of the rights of victims, and the commitment to zero tolerance regarding these types of abuses. Now, that being said, of course, the report also reminds us that such incidents are not random or isolated, but rather they are part and parcel of the operations, ideology, and economic strategy of the parties, whether they're state groups or non-state groups in many conflicts, and that these facts have been aggravated due to the fact that sexual violence has become a tactic of war and a source of income of the parties involved in conflicts, whether they're violent extremist groups, terrorists, or organized criminal groups operating in these territories or neighboring countries. movements. Movements of people within countries or among countries, of individuals fleeing these conflicts, further complicate the situation. The victims of sexual violence, Mr. President, are usually the most vulnerable people. Women, children, men of all ages, sometimes refugees or migrants, that due to conflicts find themselves trapped in crossfire and are victims of violence, sexual slavery, forced prostitution and sterilization, human trafficking, and other forms of sexual abuse. Equatorial Guinea would like to make an appeal to the parties involved in conflicts to urge them to commit to ensuring the protection of civilians in accordance with international humanitarian law, always bearing in mind the primary responsibility of national governments on this point and the need to respect the sovereignty of countries and support their efforts in the implementation of the relevant resolutions of the Security Council and of the General Assembly. Mr. President, we cannot isolate violence, including sexual violence, from the root causes of conflicts. We cannot achieve peace without investing in the sustainable development of countries and in gender equality. This is the strategy, the most effective strategy to prevent conflicts. And with this in mind, we'd like to acknowledge the aspirations of the 2063 Agenda of the African Union and the 2030 Agenda. In particular, their clear focus on people-centered sustainable development, focused on gender equality, empowerment of women, equitable economic growth within countries and among countries. We also want to recognize the cooperation and between the African Union and the United Nations and their commitment to implementing the Women, Peace and Security agenda and in combating sexual violence and armed conflicts, to combat impunity of those responsible for these atrocities and ensure accountability for these crimes. Equatorial Guinea would like to reiterate the key role of implementing resolutions 1325 of the year 2000, resolution 1820 of 2008, and resolution 2331 of 2016, and other resolutions related to these in ensuring the participation and empowerment of women in conflicts and promoting actions to prevent sexual violence in these conflicts. Now, as our country is not experiencing a situation of conflict, at the national level, our main focus is in promoting the rights of women, gender equality, and combating sexual violence as part of our strategy of sustainable development up to 2020. The determination of our country to be vigilant, ensure follow-up, and propose actions, policies, and strategies aimed at promoting women, which is reflected in the composition of our team here in the Security Council, are part and parcel of our national plan of action, of our national program of education for all, our multi-sectoral national plan of promoting women and gender equality, and through the work of our Ministry of Social Affairs and Gender Equality that are in charge of various national campaigns to combat violence against women and children. It's also important to mention the Center for the Support of Children, CANIGE, which is an institution led by the First Lady of Equatorial Guinea, and which finances groups and associations of women, urban women and rural women. Mr. President, in situations of conflict and regarding international responses to these, Equatorial Guinea would like to recommend coordinating the implementation of good practices in training of contingents recruited prior to their deployment for peacekeeping operations and through special political missions, through incorporating a gender perspective and training on sexual exploitation and abuse. We also recommend continued support for various entities within the United Nations architecture to combat sexual violence and armed conflict, and support for cooperation between these bodies and other UN bodies in charge of counterterrorism, organized crime, humanitarian responses, and sustainable development to ensure the rehabilitation and reintegration of victims especially children born of sexual violence and women who have survived these aggressions and assaults. Mr. President, I'd like to conclude by stating that Equatorial Guinea would like to reiterate its strongest condemnation of all these actions and our support for zero tolerance policy of the United Nations on sexual exploitation and abuse, and would like to express our willingness to cooperate on this issue within the Security Council based on resolutions approved on this topic. Thank you very much, Mr. President. I'd like to thank the representative of Equatorial Guinea for your statement, and I would like to now make a statement in my national capacity.
Representante del Perú.
I'd like to express my appreciation for the significant briefings made by the Deputy Secretary General Amina Mohammed and Madam Pramila Patten, as well as the testimony provided by Madam Razia Sultana. I'd also like to commend the participation by the large number of countries who have requested to participate in this open debate. My delegation wishes to especially express its gratitude for the support and the contributions of women's organizations in preparing this annual debate, as well as the informal group of experts on women, peace, and security, which Peru is honored to preside over with Sweden. We'd like to express Peru's commitment to the agenda of women, peace, and security, which has as a crucial component fighting sexual violence and conflict. We are convinced that the United Nations, and most especially the Security Council, have a very significant role to play in preventing this atrocious crime. We observe with alarm what the magnitude of the problem is and the shifting modalities of sexual violence reported in the most recent report submitted by the Secretary General. Its widespread and systematic use as a military attack tactic against collective groups should be understood and tackled as a threat to international peace and security. As a result, we should most energetically condemn any form of sexual violence in armed conflict, which in the greater majority affects women, boys, and girls. We must protect victims and guarantee that the perpetrators of these crimes be held accountable. But that is not enough. A comprehensive strategy against this scourge requires grappling with the deep-seated causes. In this regard, it's fundamental to empower women, provide equality of gender and access to justice. Evidence shows that greater participation of women in the processes of taking decisions has, as a result, less propensity to conflict. Also, defense and promotion of women's rights reduces their vulnerability. Equality and empowerment have a direct impact on international peace and security. The same occurs with access to justice. We reaffirm the absolute need to guarantee that those perpetrators of these acts of violence be held accountable before justice, and that all structural obstacles be eliminated that would impede investigation and prosecution of violations or any forms of rapes or any form of sexual violence. Likewise, due attention and rehabilitation for victims is key in order to build sustainable peace, and it necessarily must include understanding that their traumas are also psychological in nature and bring with it the potential of completely destroying the very social fabric of a community. We cannot ignore the stigma and the fear of victims, their intimidation by the attackers. Most of these cases, sexual violence is not reported, and this reflects the low level of confidence and credibility of national institutions. And what exacerbates this is the fact that the aggressors are often members of security forces who are called upon to actually protect these women. It's necessary to approach the state and the institutions for the victims. In this regard, Peru has a national plan of violence against women, which amongst other elements include sexual violence in armed conflict. The Peruvian commitment to the agenda of women, peace, and security also includes progressive protection of Peruvian women, and including women as blue helmets, in conformity with Resolution 1820. With regard to that, we'd like to highlight the importance of including, through their respective mandates, gender perspective in peacekeeping operations deployed by this Council. Also, there is the need to adequately train blue helmets to protect human rights for women and boys and children. The Security Council will continue to encourage and should continue supporting and monitoring specific commitments undertaken and prevention plans put in place for sexual violence in conflict, which are part of its agenda. We believe that it's important to recall, in keeping with Resolution 1820, that sexual crimes should not benefit from any amnesty in the context of a process to resolve conflict. We'd like to conclude our remarks by expressing our recognition and support for the work and vision of the Special Representative on Sexual Violence and Conflict and her team, and highlight the priorities set forth by the Secretary General on this topic in keeping with the need to build sustainable peace. In the words of the Secretary General, it is time to give this agenda the investment and the action that it deserves in order to replace horror with hope. Thank you very much. I resume my role now as President of the Council, and I would like to recall to all speakers that they should limit their speeches to a maximum of 4 minutes so that the Council can carry out its work expeditiously. Delegations with lengthy statements are kindly requested to circulate the text in writing and to deliver a condensed version when speaking in the chamber. I wish to inform all concerned that we will now be carrying on this open debate right through the lunch hour, as we have a large